And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome back to the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I am the Director of TeachThought Professional Development. And a couple notes before we get into our podcast today. As of today's publishing date, which is June 23rd, 2019, we are in late registration for TeachThought PBL Grow 19, our third annual summer learning conference here in Louisville, Kentucky. The dates are July 16th through 19th. If you're not aware of those dates and the details, you can go to wegrowteachers.com/grow19, or if you just go to either teachthought.com, our main website, or the wegrowteachers.com, our professional development site, you'll find links along the top for the conference, which gives you the details, the registration, and all of those things. Also, a quick reminder that we always appreciate if folks share and mention us in their social media, as well as review us on iTunes. That helps us sort of move up in the rankings and get more people to listen, which helps us to get better guests and more guests. So hopefully you find the podcast helpful, and if you do, please share it with folks who also might find it helpful. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Chloé Valdary, who is the founder of Theory of Enchantment, and her work can be found at theoryofenchantment.com. Really fascinating conversation. She's super sharp and thoughtful, and I appreciate how her brain works because it seems to be analytical in ways that are not one-sided, but really trying to figure out solutions to the problem. And her three principles were sort of the fodder for our discussion, leaning heavily into the first one, which is we are human beings, not political abstractions. And that brought us to talking about Robin DiAngelo's work, white fragility, and kind of thinking about how that might impact equity and education, and how a better way forward might be to not take that stance. And then we touched on her thinking about pop culture versus politics, and then really thinking about whole child and creating better human beings, and how her education shaped her and how she thinks about identity, and again, moving forward in a more productive way. So I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope it's helpful for you. Chloé, welcome to the podcast. I'm glad to have you on. And as I think is helpful to our listeners, let's have you give them a little bit of background on your journey to where you are now so that they have some context in the conversation that we're about to have.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. So I'm 25 years old. I have a startup called Theory of Enchantment, which essentially provides an educational curriculum that's primarily focused on mental health and resilience training, but has actually a plethora of applications that come out of that focus. And the way in which I came to this space was I was in the nonprofit world for 8 years. I was working for a series of organizations where I found myself having to actually teach Jewish students how to navigate bias on college campuses. And one of the things that I discovered was that there was a vocabulary that was being taught to students that was all about combating prejudice, but there wasn't necessarily a vocabulary that taught students how to love. And because I wanted to sort of fill that gap, I decided to create a curriculum around that, especially because like my whole philosophy is that the act of loving is actually it's a skill set. It requires practice. It requires an intimate knowledge of oneself. It requires identity formation, a healthy identity formation. It requires a lot of the things that we think about when we actually think about mental health. And so in order to really fill that need and try to teach students, both on college campuses and in high schools in general, about this skill set, I decided to create this curriculum. So that's a little bit of my background and how I got to this. My major was in international studies with a concentration in diplomacy. So I don't have an education background per se, but I think that life is an education, and I think that that philosophy certainly contributes to how I think about forming curriculum.
Yeah, there's so many strings to pull on here, and the education connections obviously are first and foremost, but you've come to some, I don't know if prominence is the right word, but you've gathered some attention for maybe making some statements or saying some things that may or may not be terribly popular. And you were working with Wall Street Journal and now New York Times. That's correct?
So I was at the Journal for a year out of college, and I never worked for the New York Times, but I have published in the New York Times.
Right. And where did you go to university?
University of New Orleans. I'm from New Orleans.
Okay. So pulling the string of your theory of enchantment, just kind of giving us the broad strokes and perhaps some deep dives here. You've got 3 principles. So we are human beings, not political abstractions, which is perhaps why people have started paying attention to you a little bit more, because there's some hot button stuff there, perhaps, and very likely. The second is criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy, and then lead with love and compassion. So what should we know about those 3 things just in general, and how you developed that? And then maybe we can kind of dive a little more deeply, especially as it connects to teaching and learning and education.
Sure. So I think that each principle contains the seeds of the subsequent principle that comes after. I think that I start with, remember that we are human beings, not political abstractions, because it's actually the most basic common sense principle. Like, of course, we're human beings. We know this. We're not tables or cups or other objects. But actually, I've also found that this is the least understood principle. And so this idea of like what it actually means to be a human being, to be beset by vulnerabilities and insecurities and aspirations and dreams and have to navigate identity, is a piece that's missing from how we have conversations sometimes in the classroom about important issues. And so that's why I started with that. And because also it lends itself to, once we understand that we're human beings, not political abstractions, a sort of corollary of that principle is that we can train ourselves not to caricature one another, and we can train ourselves not to pigeonhole or stereotype one another in these boxes, because what it means to be a human being is actually very complex and very oftentimes paradoxical. But that is how I would argue every human being actually is. There is no box that you can box a human being into. So that's why I started with that principle. And there are a set of lessons that I teach that reinforce that principle. And then that lends itself to the second principle, which is, as you said, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down and never to destroy. And that principle is really all about intent and trying to practice intent in the way we give out criticism, whether it's to a family member, whether it's to a fellow peer, whether it's teacher to a student or vice versa. In any situation, we have to be cognizant of the fact that what we should desire in giving out critique is the well-being of the person we're actually criticizing. So criticism should not be done in service of stroking one's ego. It shouldn't be done in service of signaling status or trying to obtain power. It should actually be done in service of trying to see the full potential of the person you're actually criticizing. And then, of course, there are lessons that I teach to reinforce that principle. And then the final principle is actually a culmination of the first 2 principles, because what students realize in going through the program is that all this time, by learning about what it means to be a human being, not an abstraction and not a stereotype, by learning how to criticize in order to uplift and empower, that entire process is actually a process of learning how to love. And so the third principle is simply the culmination or a wrap up, if you will, of those first 2 principles, and really honing in on that key point. And there are a lot of different types of source material that I teach to reinforce that third principle, from examples of love in philosophy, examples of love in action, taking what we learned in the first two principles and really applying it to sort of overcoming some of our knee-jerk reactions toward people who some would argue are in society undeserving of love. But that's the basic idea behind those three principles and how one subsequently flows from the previous.
So does it help at all to have you or to sort of unpack how you think about our political landscape? And maybe it doesn't at all, but as I look at your Twitter feed, for example, and again, just to think about context, and again, it may or may not really be very important. I'm curious what you think about this, is that you have connections with folks who are clearly left-leaning and pretty liberal, and then also you've been on the Rubin Report, which I wouldn't say is conservative, but certainly some people would say he is, or is enabling some conservatism in ways that are, I don't want to get into that, but how do you think about our current political landscape, and is it helpful?
Well, that's a good question. It's a very deep question. I'd say that, I came out of this, or I came to the Theory of Enchantment partially in having to deal with the political landscape, but I think that was sort of a surface level. I think I really came to the Theory of Enchantment trying to navigate concepts of identity, because I think that that's what underpins a lot of our political debates and disagreements. And I would say the tenor and tone of those debates and disagreements are really about identity and identity formation. And how we come to define what matters in our own personal lives. But I do think the fact that I am friends or associates with both people on the right and the left is a testament to the Theory of Enchantment's effect on myself. Because if you would have talked to me a few years ago, I'm not sure that the makeup of my friends would have reflected sort of like being friends with people from both parties or multiple different ideologies. And because of the Theory of Enchantment, I tend to care a little less, actually, about people's political affiliations and more about other things that are important to me personally. And in terms of our current political landscape, I think it's pretty bad right now. It's pretty toxic. I also think that Twitter is a bit of its own world, and it's not necessarily reflective of how the average American thinks about being friends with his or her neighbor that may be politically opposed to them. At the same time, I think that there is ample evidence that would suggest that there is hyperpolarization even beyond Twitter. And just in terms of regionally and geographically, people tend to grow up around people or gravitate toward people that think the same way they do, as opposed to seeking out disagreement or seeking out ideological diversity. And I think that there's nothing necessarily wrong with that unless the society is actually hyper tribalist, in which case it becomes a problem, because then we're society being really informed by fear and not love. Then we're a society informed by fear of each other and fear of sort of the perceived or real threats that come from each other. And not all of this, by the way, has implications for the educational world separate from politics. All of this is actually just an example of the human condition playing itself out on very political terms, but it is the human condition nonetheless. So we can see this type of dynamic happening in terms of when we see people being bullied in schools. We can see this dynamic happening when people sometimes are gravitating toward unseemly organizations that give them a sense of belonging and purpose. So, for example, if you study the psychology of gangs, even if you study the psychology of extremists movements, a lot of this psychology is the same. So even though it has implications for the political moment that we live in now, it also has implications in general for the human condition and a lot of challenges that we see both in the educational world and sort of, I guess you would say, the pockets on the periphery of the educational world, where you're talking about students who may, after going to school, actually, instead of going home and being with their parents, might be hanging out with other members who are either in a gang or have shown potential of wanting to join a gang.
Right. Well, so the identity piece is I think, a really important consideration, and the political abstraction as we think about how we help schools think about equity and social justice, that's an important piece there. I'm just curious personally, because you're a woman of color, do you feel like there's any particular added pressure or that people look at you as a thought leader or someone who can or should be talking about these kinds of issues perhaps differently, or do you get criticized because you seem to take a more logical approach and maybe your identity is less important than the principles and the thinking?
So that's a very good question. I would say that it requires a multi-part answer. On the one hand, I don't really sense that I am criticized that much on account of me being a person of color and not taking certain positions. Now, that could be that I'm just not paying attention to people who do criticize me, and so I don't actually see it. Or it could mean that the criticism isn't really happening, or it's happening in very small ways, and we could be like perception versus reality, or is perception reality, right? So on some level, it's very possible that, I'm sure I know that there are individuals who criticize me and criticize my positions, but I don't think that it really is relevant in any way that sort of undermines the points or the principles that I promote in the Theory of Enchantment. I think they're pretty rock solid, and I think that they sort of win the day on a certain level. At the same time, so there's this terminology of living in a colorblind society that some have used as a aspiration, and I don't necessarily hold to that. And I get what they're saying when they mean that, and I understand that they mean they don't want to judge people by their skin color, and I obviously agree with that. But at the same time, my culture informs who I am and what my identity is, and I think my culture gives me great value. Being an African American, I come from a very specific tradition, and I think that informs how I see the world, and that informs certainly some of the lessons that I built into the Theory of Enchantment. There's a lot of Dr. King in the Theory of Enchantment. There's a lot of James Baldwin in the Theory of Enchantment, and I don't think it's coincidental that I happen to be a person of color and that those figures are included. I think I perhaps pay greater attention to those figures because they are part of the tradition that I come from. And so I think that demonstrates a way in which, who I am, and certainly not just color on a surface level, but just, the cultural tradition of my ancestors. I think that certainly informs how I think about the world and how I think about, solving challenges in the world. But at the same time, I think that there's a great quote from a famous Rabbi Soloveitchik, who said that out of the particular lies the universal. So I don't think it's a tension, but it's a healthy tension between the particular and the universal. And because I draw from the particular, I'm able to actually affect change on a universal level, which is not exactly what one would necessarily expect.
Mm-hmm. So the equity pieces that I mentioned. So thinking about when you said Martin Luther King Jr., thinking about those sort of bigger circles and inclusivity, and where we all have our individual identities, but being hyper-focused on those and using those or even weaponizing those is becoming seemingly more problematic in our climate and our culture right now. And I'm curious what you know about Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility work, and how, because to me, as I read that book, the sort of antithesis of Martin Luther King Jr. sort of philosophy of sort of drawing that circle bigger and including more and understanding that we are all humans as you say, human beings, and that there's this sort of, whether she says white fragility or, you could say it to Me Too, those are the political abstractions. So when you think about equity in education, how does that work look to you?
So this is another great question. So as you can imagine, Robin DiAngelo's work is not exactly my cup of tea. And there are many reasons for this. I was actually discussing this with a few people last week, there are different ways to think about sort of different approaches in social justice. And Robin DiAngelo fits, her philosophy fits in the category of what I would call apocalyptic. So there's prophetic and there's apocalyptic. So I would say Dr. King and Baldwin and many others heralding from the 60s, Maya Angelou comes from a very prophetic vision, meaning they were able to articulate a future society or a vision for society that was essentially aspirational, and that was essentially all about building a new potential. Whereas Robert DiAngelo's work seems to sit in a space that's all about dismantling society. And that's very different, even in basic vocabulary. There's a very different way of seeing the world if all you talk about is about how to dismantle structures, as opposed to building the beloved community, which is what Dr. King talked about. There's also the issue of racial essentialism in Robin DiAngelo's work, in the sense that for her, the irreducible sort of thing or being that white people can be reduced to is simply white people, their whiteness, which is sort of an arbitrary concept. And what people mean by whiteness is they mean the embodiment of certain negative attributes, whether you're talking about trying to gain power in nefarious ways, trying to engage in colonialism and other violent types of work. But the problem with that is, number one, these things are not white. These are very human things that human beings from all across the world have engaged in. You know, when Boko Haram in Nigeria is raping and pillaging, it is not engaging in whiteness. And neither is China, when it historically was very nefarious toward Japan, right? That wasn't whiteness. That was actually a very human trait, and a very negative human trait, but human nonetheless. And I think I can sum up the problem with Robin DiAngelo's work by quoting Baldwin, actually. And this is very important because that people understand that Baldwin's worldview was not only not Robin DiAngelo's worldview, but actually, I would say, completely antithetical to her worldview. So Baldwin actually wrote an essay in 1948 called Everybody's Protest Novel, where he criticized a few protest novels that had come out then, one of which was Native Son, which was interesting because that means that there was this very vibrant debate going on in the Black community about literature and how folks should be represented within literature. And Baldwin said two things. One of the things he said was you don't need to humanize your Black characters by dehumanizing your white ones. And more to the point, he said the problem with the protest novel lies in its rejection of the human being. It lies in its insistence or in its rejection of the human being's power, beauty, and dread, and its insistence that it is only the category of a human being that is real and cannot be transcended. And that last part is really central to Robin DiAngelo's work, this notion that what is real about white people is simply their whiteness, and it cannot be transcended. That is the heart of what she teaches. Mm-hmm. And it is antithetical to the spirit of Baldwin. It is antithetical to the spirit of King. And it is antithetical to the idea that we have this transcendent humanity that we can actually all speak to and talk about, and that actually unites us despite our differences. And I don't understand, I'm not quite sure of the vision that Dr. DiAngelo is articulating in promoting her philosophy. I'm not quite sure what she wants the world to look like, actually, if everyone goes through this program. I'm not quite sure how we would actually function as a society if we all went through her program. And I can tell you also that there's a language missing of reconciliation. I'm not quite sure how her philosophy would actually lead to the creation of the beloved community, which is very much about looking for or being moved deeply by an overwhelming concern for your fellow neighbor, regardless of skin color, which is a different type of conversation. And also, we're only talking about race. Like, there's implications for Robert DiAngelo's framework if in a conversation that's not about race, in a conversation that's strictly about the educational setting. If someone is bullying another human being, if a kid is bullying another kid, do we then have to have a whole conversation about how, well, if the kid bullying another kid is white and the kid that he's bullying is black, or vice versa? Do we have to have a conversation about, how this person's whiteness is getting in the way or is informing this dynamic? Or can we have a conversation about how to stop the bad behavior from happening and how to, if at all possible, help the parties in this dispute reconcile with each other so that we can actually create a more beloved community and move forward together, not as enemies, but as actual friends dedicated to the well-being of one another.
Yeah, so it gets into, in my mind, it gets into the sort of this balance between logical and rational thinking versus emotional and empathy thinking. And I've mentioned it before. I don't know if you're familiar with Paul Bloom's work around empathy and the difference between cognitive empathy, which is understanding somebody's problems or troubles that they're going through, and then emotional empathy, which is I feel your pain. That's sort of that Bill Clinton model, which if you are following the emotional empathy path, it can be sort of ruinous in that you make poor decisions because it makes you feel better, which sounds, we all want to feel better, but right. It's to me sort of that balance. And I've seen white educators on Facebook or Twitter who seem to be, and I don't want to linger too long on Robin DiAngelo's work because it's certainly, there's many other things that are important to talk about, but that there's this, whether you say virtue signaling or something, where it's like, I'm going to put out there that this feels so bad. I feel bad for what my fellow white human beings have created for African Americans, minorities, or whatever. And as a white male, I feel bad too. But how do we navigate that in a way that is logical, rational, and produces some results, not just makes you feel better? Because making you feel better may not actually help the people that you're trying to help.
Right. It's also a question, I think there's status and shame plays a role in a lot of this. And if you are in a position where you're sort of, not to say that this is necessarily the case, but I think that it's possible that feeling bad can bleed into a condescending sort of persona, and in which case a person actually begins to feel great status from simply feeling bad. Right,
there's social currency there.
Exactly, about themselves, about someone else, about their position as related to another person's position in society, whether real or perceived. And then, especially, Dr. DiAngelo's model is sort of this very, ironically, somewhat punitive, self-flagellating process that comes out of feeling status from feeling sort of in a position of sadness. And that is also a problem because that's not the dynamic that we're actually looking for. That's a very unhealthy relationship, right? No one would ever take a couple and take what we just described. If you were to say that a romantic couple was in this situation where one spouse felt like he was in a position where he felt great pity, right, for his spouse, and he felt that he could condescend toward his spouse as a result, and he gained great status from feeling condescending toward that. So no one would ever say that that's a healthy relationship, right? That's a very dysfunctional relationship,
right.
And we understand that, right, in that context. But then in other contexts, for some reason, we don't understand that, and we sort of throw out that conventional wisdom, which I find very interesting.
Well, it's sort of a codependency thing of, and I have two daughters. I mention on the podcast fairly regularly. I try to help them understand, first of all, how to have hard conversations and be comfortable with that discomfort. But also, one of the things that resonates with with me in the work that you're doing is building capacity to be really sure of yourself, and getting back to the codependency thing, is that you should, as a human being, want to need people as little as possible, but want people as much as possible. And as a child, of course, you need your parents, you need somebody to take care of you. And as a parent, what we want to do is we want to build that capacity for them to be autonomous as quickly as possible, especially financially, right? So there's time for you to move out of the house and pay your own bills kind of thing. And that's the same thing in a romantic relationship. If it's that codependency that can really exhaust you, if you are you are needed, and even worse, pity them and sort of condescend. But that's I think it's a really hard relationship to develop if one of the parties is really insecure in who they are and what their identity is.
Right. And it's great that you brought that up, because insecurity it seems to be a very strong narrative in a lot of these issues. It seems to me that there's actually a great deal of insecurity at the center of Dr. D'Angelo's philosophy, because why is there this need to signal status by feeling bad about other people, right? There's a difference between understanding that there are challenges and problems in the world, and so how can we move forward to tackle them, knowing that we have limited resources, knowing that nothing will be perfect because life is imperfect and human beings are imperfect, but how do we actually come together to co-create a society where the challenges are mitigated as much as possible? There's a difference between that and just sort of this process whereby we try to signal our own importance by talking about how bad we are constantly. That's a very different, that I feel like falls into the prophetic versus apocalyptic model, or hope versus fear model, that I think a lot of these conversations seem to fall into one category or the other.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. So then when we're thinking about the work around schools, I'm curious what your K-12 career was like. And one of the things that I think is an absolute reality that is undeniable is that there are portions of our society, and African Americans being a large part of them, who are disadvantaged in the opportunities that they are afforded to them, or that are afforded to them by schools. And so in our hometown here, Louisville, Kentucky, there is a school district where there seems, it's not hard to point out some of the differences between some of the East End schools and the West End schools. And so that dynamic is in place in lots of places around the country, and it's not always black-white. I mean, if you look at rural Appalachia, that dynamic shows up as well. So how do we, how do you think about sort of leveling that playing field, that equity of opportunity for African Americans or any minorities, or I guess any disadvantage? Because again, white Appalachia is not a minority, but they are certainly disadvantaged. Right.
So this is a big question, and I'm not sure I have all of the answers to solve this problem. But I can tell you from my experience...
You're 25, you don't have the answers? Come on.
Unfortunately, I don't. But what I can tell you is, in my experience, I can tell you about the upbringing and educational experience I had. So I went to a couple of different schools growing up. So from kindergarten through third grade, I went to a predominantly African American school, Langston Hughes Elementary. And then from fourth grade to sixth grade, I went to Hines, which was at the time, I don't actually remember the demographic, but I think it was more white than African American. It's actually funny because that has changed since then. My little sisters, I have two twin sisters who just graduated from Hines, and the makeup is actually, I think, more African American now than it was when I went. But I actually had a very diverse educational experience because of that mix. And then seventh grade, Hurricane Katrina came. So I was away from New Orleans for a year. My family was away from New Orleans for a year. We went to Alexandria, Louisiana for a year, and I attended 7th grade at Pineville High School, and that was also a mixed school. And then I came back to New Orleans and attended McDonald 35, which is a predominantly African-American school from 8th to 9th grade. And then from 10th to 12th, I attended Franklin, which is, Benjamin Franklin has a reputation. It's the #1 school in Louisiana. And very diverse, very mixed school from people from all backgrounds. Like I went to school with Asians and white people and Hispanic people, and the whole sort of world essentially was represented in that school. Mm-hmm. And I think that there were definitely pronounced differences between some of the more mixed schools and some of the predominantly African-American schools, but there were also differences in the types of schools. So there were differences between the public schools and the charter schools that I attended. So Franklin is a charter school, and McDonald 35 was at the time a public school. McDonald 35 was also considered to be, prior to Hurricane Katrina, a very academically rigorous school. Still predominantly African-American, and then post-Katrina, things started to slowly slide down in terms of standards. So I think there are a lot of factors that affected the performances of the schools in question, and it wasn't simply about racial disparity. So I feel like being able to tackle these problems requires a multivariate approach and multi-factor approach, and understanding that there is multiple factors at work in a lot of these different situations. I also have to say that because I attended Langston Hughes High School, that was like my first elementary school, elementary school. That was actually very important to shaping my identity. Because I learned about Harriet Tubman, and I learned about Langston Hughes, and I learned about Maya Angelou, and I learned about all these different, and that was a very identity forming moment, right? Identity forming years that shaped the way I thought about African American history. It was a very aspirational image of African Americans that I got from that school, from attending that school, which I think it was very important in shaping how I view the world. So even though I could argue that perhaps Hines had more resources than Langston Hughes on some level, it was actually very critical that I went to Langston Hughes first. But that being said, now that I'm doing the work that I'm doing, I think that one of the things I would do, or I would think about, is trying to get people who are already stakeholders in society to invest more in education and invest more in different forms of education. So as you know, I'm sure LeBron James funded the school, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, specifically for disadvantaged students. And I think that we should be seeing more of that happen. I think that we need other stakeholders in the community to fill the gaps that are presently at work. So in the neighborhood that I live in, Brooklyn, in the neighborhood that I live in, there is a organization that I volunteer for called Children of Promise, which mentors kids whose parents are incarcerated. And that was started by someone in the community, right? And so now it's a fully functioning program, and it services the gap that a lot of young people have because they might only have one parent in the home because of those extenuating circumstances. So I think that people in the community have to be anchors. I think that the churches, the already existing schools need, after school programs, you need all these things that can fill the gaps. Now, we also have to recognize that some of the gaps that exist to a certain extent can't be filled. Meaning that if you have a student, or you have a bunch of students coming from homes where there's only one parent, or where there's a lot of poverty in the home, there's only so much that a school can do to try to mitigate that. Because after the 8 hours of being in the classroom, that child has to go back home and deal with that environment, right? And so there's a limit to what a school can do to rectify that situation, unfortunately. But there are things that schools can do. I know I was watching a segment recently, I think it was on CBS, about a principal who noticed that all of his, or many of his students or actually came from very poor socioeconomic backgrounds and weren't coming to school with clean clothes, and that caused a lot of shame, and that shame led to a lot of fights and bullying and things like that. And so what he did was he actually built washer and dryer machines in the schools, so that they actually had a place to wash their clothes, and that ended up limiting that factor of shame. That also tells the students that, like, I'm not just the administrator that you see for half the day. I genuinely care about your well-being. I genuinely care about, your sense of identity, your sense of self-esteem. It's very important to me personally. So I'm investing this. And so, not all administrators or principals will be thinking in those terms, but unfortunately or fortunately, that's actually what I think it means to talk about building the beloved community, right? So again, it's all about recognizing the fact that there are certain things that are outside of our control, but still, as administrators, as principals, as teachers, and I know that it's hard with limited resources, and the teachers have their lives, the administrators have their lives, etc. But to teach is one of the most important, if not the most important task, in my opinion, that person could actually engage in. And so we just have to think differently and on a wider scale about what our students are actually dealing with when they come into the classroom, and how we can use our resources, limited though they may be, to help those students and to further those students along.
Yeah, so the cultural pieces behind disadvantaged and poverty stricken kids, or however you want to say that, is, I think that's an important point, that schools can not sustain being a proxy for parents, and so that's an important piece. When having been to New Orleans, and it's a great town, and having some knowledge of the charter school situation, especially post Katrina, and thinking through that, but in talking with you and looking at your work, you're very, you're smart, you're fluent and just thoughtful and knowledgeable, and all of the things that we want in a human being as a thinker. Did you feel, well, first of all, what helped you, if it wasn't just school, what helped you be that kind of person that you have grown into, and how did that fit culturally with your peers?
Okay, so I'm going to try to unpack this question a bit. I mean, obviously, I'm a product of my upbringing. So, my parents, I have to give them credit for the person that I am today. My mother's a homemaker, my father's a banker. But that doesn't really tell the full story. I guess my parents are very, they are ironically cosmopolitan in a certain way. And I say ironic because I grew up in a home that was very religious, and but religious in a non-mainstream way. So I grew up in a house that was very, very Christian, but very Christian in an almost Seventh-day Adventist type way. So we didn't grow up Seventh-day Adventist, but the denomination that we adhere to is very similar to Seventh-day Adventists in the sense that, Seventh-day Adventists go to church on Saturday and not Sunday. So like we went to church on Saturday and not Sunday, but we also kept all of the sort of like kosher style laws of the Bible. So I grew up not eating pork or shellfish. I grew up keeping all of the holy days, so Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and all these things. And what that did, perhaps inadvertently, was give me a worldview of society. It gave me an understanding that other cultures existed. It gave me an understanding of paradox, right? In the sense that I grew up in an Orthodox home that was both Orthodox and rebellious, because it was Orthodox in the sense that it was strict, but it was rebellious in the sense that it rebelled against a certain mainstream form of Christianity. And that's a paradox in and of itself that you have to sort of like navigate and learn about as a child. I also grew up in a home where my father in particular was very much interested in world affairs and international affairs. That's probably why I ended up majoring in international studies. But like, every Friday night we would I have four sisters, and we would have been assigned to look up a country and then bring to the family information on that country, what that country's language is, what that country's currency is, religion, etc. So like that gave me, and then like I grew up around in a very diverse environment because of that sort of going back and forth between predominantly African American schools and predominantly diverse schools, which actually created this conversation, I think, between the two in my identity. So there was this constant conversation between the particular and the universal as a result of that upbringing. So I think that is sort of that creates like a certain depiction of my upbringing, and I think all of that contributed to how I became who I am today.
Yeah, and so one of the things that is evident is that there's, and this is certainly some genetics, and that you have at least a high processor speed. Your thinking brain is definitely a thinking brain, but that you also seem to have engaged in lots of thinking as a child, which is one of those things that schools can only do in limited amounts because of just the exposure and the time, right? So one of the pieces that I find really interesting for disadvantaged kids, and I've asked this in some podcasts and outside of podcasts, when you see, and you weren't a disadvantaged kid from the sounds of it, but that when you have kids coming from disadvantaged situations, that the ones who sort of seem to have made it out because the system doesn't really support them in ways that are really impactful and powerful in building that capacity, is that they found somebody or somebody found them that really latched onto and pushed them and helped them to think in more deeply, and that just seems like a really big piece. And so culturally, how do we build more of those structures in place to, as you say, empower kids and build capacity? I'm found that people say, sometimes they'll say, we're only as strong as our weakest link, which is certainly, there's some truth to that, but I'm more fond of saying something like we're only as strong as our ability to build capacity in our weakest links. So how do we build that capacity in those weakest links and do it in a way that's empowering, sort of teach them how to fish, not give them the fish kind of thing. And culturally, there's some things that are missing in certain cultures, and some would argue that the African American culture in particular. I don't know how you feel about that.
So in terms of cultural competency, I would say I'm reminded of the words of the guy who actually runs Children of Promise on Saturdays, Mr. Walker. One of the things he teaches new volunteers once they come in is that as adults, we actually have to recognize that we are role models, whether we want to be or not. So kids, on the subways, and thinking about New York, but in general, kids on the subway system, or, just kids we encounter in our everyday walk of life, they are looking at adults and then they go out and model that behavior. Right. So we have a responsibility to model behavior that is beneficial toward those kids. And we also have a responsibility to actually know that, right? So like, I didn't actually really think about that or wasn't cognizant about that until someone told me. And I think that the majority of adults, if I were to guess, are in America or in general, probably not aware that kids are actually looking to them for guidance, whether they want to be in that position or not. So I think that one of the things that would be helpful for us as a society is that if we actually just became more aware of that and more cognizant of that. I don't know if you've listened to David Foster Wallace's speech, "This is Water," but I think it sort of like speaks to that dynamic. In terms of African American culture, I think that like a lot of the things that have been brought up, for example, by Professor Glenn Lowry, are relevant and accurate about some of the opportunities for growth that we have going on in our culture. But at the same time, I actually think that there has been a vibrant conversation about this happening for a very long time within pop cultural circles that don't necessarily get a lot of airtime in the academic world. So if you were to, on average, look up an episode of The Breakfast Club, for example, which has a lot of cultural currency in the Black community. We're talking about these issues on a daily basis. If you look at folks like, the rapper Killer Mike, who's like very much always talking about these issues on his own platforms and on the platforms where he's invited to speak, we are talking about these issues. If you look at shows, I think it's interesting because, when people ask me what my politics are, I always answer pop culture, because I think that pop culture actually shows us who we are more than politics. And I think that politics is upstream from culture. And so if you look at shows like Blackish, for example, and you think about the conversations that are being had on Blackish about our own society or our own culture. And if you look at older shows like A Different World, right, which was phenomenally groundbreaking and standard setting in certain ways. And if you look at the conversations that were being had then, and then if you try to think about conversations that are, if you were to juxtapose these two shows together, the conversations that they're sort of having with each other, I think that would be an incredible resource that could serve as another conversation starter for the stakeholders in our communities. But I think that we are having these conversations, and I think that one of the problems I have with sort of the excesses of certain more right-leaning platforms and right-leaning conversations on this topic is the ignoring of the fact that these conversations are happening. They're just not happening necessarily in academia. But when Jay-Z got on stage after Nipsey Hussle's death and rapped a freestyle about how, we have to get out of the mentality that many of us have been living in that are associated with sort of inner city, very dysfunctional habits, that conversation is moving the culture forward. And we don't necessarily think of that as culture shaping. We sometimes think of policy in DC as culture shaping, but again, politics is upstream from culture. So I think that the more I would encourage people to pay more attention to that, because that is the heart of what's actually going on, I think, in our conversations that we're having with each other. And I think over time you will see policies and you will see initiatives and you will see projects come out of that space. I think what Jay-Z is doing with criminal justice reform is actually very much a part of the concepts of restorative justice, but that dovetails precisely with what I'm talking about when I bring up Dr. King's beloved community and Baldwin's view of race relations, because I'll tell you what I mean by that. I want to break that down a little bit. Like I said, I do a little bit of work in terms of criminal justice reform, and I do it's centered in restorative justice spaces. And the idea is that you can both restore the life of the person who was harmed, and you can restore the life of the person who did the harming, right? And it's possible to bring about reconciliation between the two. And that is in service of what we think about when we think about the beloved community. But I also do work when it comes to trying to bring former extremists back into society. So I also do that type of work when it comes to bringing former members of the KKK, for example, back into society and rehabilitate them back into society. So the central narrative is the same, actually, in both of those situations. It's all a question of identity. It's all a question of navigating insecurity, navigating shame, searching for redemption, essentially. It's a very aspirational, prophetic vision, right? And my job is, in some respects, to bring those two conversations together and make people realize that we're actually doing the same thing. But both of those conversations are very separate and very different from the model that, for example, Dr. D'Angelo is promoting, right? And so I think that a lot of what I talk about is breaking the fourth wall and allowing people to come to see that let's say there are two people in conflict. And Jay-Z actually talked about this in his interview with the New York Times. The person who is often feeling shame and feeling bullied, or just feeling, let's say, shame, and sort of puts themselves in a shell and tries to defend themselves aggressively against another person who they don't want to see them hurting. What that person doesn't realize is that the inner dynamics that are informing their emotional instability are actually also at work in the person that they're fighting against. So they're aware of their own selves, they're aware of their own insecurities, they're aware of their own pain, but they're not aware that the same pain that is affecting them is actually affecting the person that they're about to fight, that they're about to be in conflict with. Mm-hmm. And so the more I think we can have conversations that raise that awareness, that break the fourth wall, not just across racial lines, but in general, between human beings in general.
Right.
And this is where we get to that sort of point about the transcendent capacity of human beings. The more we can raise awareness of that in society, whether it's through the cultural conversations we're having on the Breakfast Club, whether it's strictly in the educational world, in the academy, or in other ways, I think we get closer to the creation of that beloved community.
Right. I don't know if you're familiar with the sort of metamodern approach, postmodern to modernity to metamodern, sort of that whole child approach and really building human beings as opposed to just, when you think about school, preparing kids to do well in school. And if we build better human beings, I think we're going to also have people who are career successful and all those things. You mentioned pop culture and politics and some of the connections there. As a person of 25 years old and being a deep thinker, do you have much, or I guess how much hope do you have in our political system to solve some of these problems? And you sort of answered it. I was thinking about it while you're talking, thinking about pop culture affecting politics, but do you have much hope?
I mean, I'm certainly much more optimistic now. Maybe that's ironic because it's a very toxic time right now, but mm-hmm. I also think that there have been other toxic times in our politics where I wasn't alive then, sure. But we had an entire civil war, lest we forget. So I think that there are perhaps moments in American history that are actually way worse than where we find ourselves now. Mm-hmm. I am concerned about the effect of social media on our ability to want to come together. But I also believe in the enduring American spirit, and I do think it is possible. And hope is I feel like hope is more of an active verb than a state of being. And so if I say that I have hope, that means that I only have hope to the extent that I am putting in the work, right? Mm-hmm. And it only will work if we put in the work. So yeah, I mean, I think it would be evident that I didn't have hope if I wasn't trying to put in the work.
Right.
So to that extent, I do think it's possible.
Well, I wonder, and I'm mindful of your time, we got to wrap up here, and I want to give you an opportunity to share links and places as well. But I wonder about how younger people are thinking about our political system or disengaging from it, perhaps in favor of pop culture. But I do think, as you mentioned, there's a strong connection. And with schools, I think about policy and how policymakers seem to just move at the slowest pace in making change. But if mm-hmm. pop culture, i.e. parents, really put pressure on policymakers, then it would change more quickly. So perhaps the disengagement from politics as, let's say, voters per se, but being really demanding different in pop culture, there's at least some hope in affecting that. So, Chloé, I want to give you an opportunity to, I know you have a podcast, you have a website, Twitter, all those things, any of those things. Where can people and where should people find you?
Sure. So if people are interested in learning more about the Theory of Enchantment, you can go to theoryofenchantment.com, learn more about the curriculum. There are links for students, educators, and educators alike. If you're interested in checking out the online curriculum, it is on Teachable. So that's theoryofenchantment.com/teachable. There's also a link to that on theoryofenchantment.com. And of course, follow the Theory of Enchantment podcast if it pleases you. Theory of Enchantment is also on Twitter and Facebook. I'm on Twitter. That's where I most prominently am active on social media. My handle is C Valdary, so CVALDARY. But much more important than following me is actually following Theory of Enchantment. And really, I encourage all of you to try to explore that curriculum. I'm really proud of it, and I think that it'll hopefully be useful in the classroom and even beyond in trying to shape our conversations about how we can improve as individuals, as citizens, and as a nation.
Well, again, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure. I enjoy hearing the words coming from your brain, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.